Hello and welcome back. I am Lisa Hayward and I'm from the Department of Education, and I'm joined again by my dear colleagues Molly White and Catherine Leswing. Today is a continuation of our Summer 21 series, and we're actually going to be focusing on part 3 of our summer session today, which is developing a Tier 1 system and practices with the focus on developing a school-wide behavior response plan. Last week, we looked at school-wide behavior expectations, and the week prior to that, we looked at Tier 1 systems. So sit tight today for a really invigorating and relevant discussion of school-wide behavior response plans. So from a preventative lens, why should we create a school-wide behavior response plan? And there are a couple of points that you might want to familiarize yourself with about their relevance from the preventative perspective. Primarily, they ensure consistency for staff. The staff will understand when and how to respond to specific types of disruptive behavior. It allows us to define a classroom managed versus office managed behaviors for staff. It guides data entry for understanding trends in behavior. It helps staff determine the appropriate responses to specific behaviors. And we always put our students first. So it also gives students consistency and knowledge of what's expected of them in every situation and in the different environments within the school arena. So to focus now in more detail, I'm going to hand off to our MTSSB expert, Catherine Leswing.
Thanks, Lisa, and thank you all for joining us today. So last session, we focused on developing school-wide behavior expectations with your Tier 1 team, if you have one. Perhaps it's a leadership team, but your school is really interested in this, at this point, in establishing a Tier 1 system, a prevention system for all students at the school. And similarly to when you sat down and developed your school-wide behavior expectations, those 3 to 5 positively stated guidelines for students, we also want to consider some things, the same things actually, before we go out and develop a behavior response plan. And so those things that the team should be thinking about include involving all staff, students, and families in the development of the behavior response plan. We know that there's more buy-in and more success when the entire school community is part of the process and has input on what's happening and what will be rolled out. So it's not as quick and easy as if, a top-down approach, the school leadership quickly puts together a behavior response plan. It does take a little bit more time, but the value in it is that students will be more bought in, families will understand what's happening in the school building and feel ownership. And so it has longer-term sustainability. We also want to make sure that the behavior response plan is contextually and culturally appropriate for the students, that it will be guiding. And so thinking about, what age level is this behavior response plan for, making sure that the language is accessible. Similarly, if you have a high Spanish speaking population or population that speaks a different language, considering translating the behavior response plan as well as the school-wide expectations, and making this kind of feeds into the last one here, which is looking at disaggregated data to ensure that these behavior responses are working for all subgroups of students. So making sure that not one subgroup of students is getting a higher proportion of behavior responses, and if that is happening, thinking about why is that happening, and can we do something, can we tweak something so that it's fair for everyone. So steps for implementing school-wide expectations. This you saw in our last session, and we just wanted to draw attention to it here because today's session is really getting down into the nitty-gritty of of step 7, which is developing a continuum for discouraging violations of expectations. Discouraging may or may not be the best term here, but really, how do we respond to and show students that that upholding the expectations is the best for the school community? And when they aren't able to uphold those expectations, how do we respond to make sure students can be successful? So right now I'm going to walk you through how you might go about doing this with your team. So this really should be something that you could look at as a template for walking through creating a behavior response plan. The first step is to really choose a format. There's no shortage of formats out there. These are 2 that we see used often. On the left-hand side, you see a sort of a flow chart of sorts. And the first question is really, after the problem behavior or the disruptive behavior has been observed, deciding whether or not that behavior should be office managed. And if the answer to that question is no, you have a series of choices for the classroom staff or school staff to choose from on how to respond to that behavior. And then on the left-hand side, you also have sort of a flow chart of how to respond to it if it is office managed. Option 2 on the right-hand side is more of a table, and you can see that this school chose to write their school expectations: be respectful, be responsible, etc. on the left-hand side, and then they identified the behaviors and defined the behaviors and then said what would happen, what would be the response for the first occurrence, second occurrence, third occurrence. These are just 2 examples. They're really not the only formats to choose from, but a good starting place for your team is deciding what format do you want to use for your behavior response plan template. The next step would be deciding which behaviors to name specifically for classroom managed. So what behaviors do you want to make it the responsibility of the teacher to handle? Here are some examples that we pulled directly from behavior response plans. Again, this is not an exhaustive list. Your school may already have a list, and so you should definitely use that to build off of and to compare and contrast. Down at the bottom, if you were doing this with a team, there's a space for comments, and it's always good to just have a conversation. Say, yes, we like this one. No, we don't think it's necessary to have this. So for example, there are some that are more appropriate for older students, and that goes back to that culturally and contextually relevant plan and forethought. One question you may want to consider as you're going through this is, how can we make the language more restorative? In MTSSB, we focus on and value having restorative practices in place. And oftentimes when we're dealing with behavior, the typical approach has been punitive. And restorative is a little bit different. It focuses on experts often talk about the 5 R's of restorative practices. So it focuses on building relationships, having respect, responsibility, repairing the harm done by the disruptive or problematic behavior, and then reintegrating that student back into their environment. So not excluding, but bringing them back in. And so if there are behaviors that are named that might feel a little accusatory or like they have a value judgment attached to them, is there a way that you could make that so it's more bringing students back into the fold and valuing that respect and responsibility? So, I'm trying to think of an example here. Non-compliance, defiance, disrespect. That might just be described by disrespect. You could define it more in a definition, but non-compliance, defiance implies rule breaking, and there can be a value judgment like shame attached to it for the student. After you've defined your classroom managed behaviors, you can move on to thinking about what behaviors should really always be office managed. And again, we have a list here. They tend to be more serious. You likely already have district or school guidance identifying some of these behaviors. And so again, feel free to use that as a base, and you can have that same discussion as a group down at the bottom. What comments, you can go through the behaviors one by one as a group, you can have just an open discussion, and then how can we make the language more restorative if restorative practices is something that your school values and wants to encourage. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to the other MTSSB expert on the call, Molly White.
Thank you so much, Catherine. So Catherine just walked us through which behaviors you may want to choose as classroom managed versus office managed. And now that you have that organized, we would like to walk you through the next steps. So you know which behaviors your classroom teachers or staff may be trying to manage in their classroom, but how are they going to do this? So here is kind of a flow chart for the classroom. If there's a first occurrence, these are some things or strategies your teacher may try to kind of redirect the behavior. So verbal redirection is a great example of that. I'm not going to walk through every single one, but if the behavior continues to a second occurrence, there's a few more options that the teacher could or staff member could try with the student. And then the third occurrence, you can see some slightly more, some more in-depth responses, maybe having a conference, possible detention, looking at behavior contracts. But again, like we did on the previous slides, we would encourage you to think about how we can make this language more restorative. And how can the process be more restorative as well? Is an after school detention the best way for this student to kind of respond to their problem behavior or to the challenging behavior that was there? And this step is really important because we want to ensure that there's some sort of consistency with expectations as the student travels through the school. If the first occurrence in one classroom is that they get a verbal redirection, and then the first occurrence in another classroom is that they're getting detention, that's going to leave a disconnect for the student. They're not going to know what to expect when they're operating in different classrooms. And on the next slide, just like we did with classroom behaviors, we would encourage you to kind of level set on office managed responses. So when a behavior escalates to that need for the office to manage it, what is the expectation? And anybody in the office should kind of know what that expectation is, again, for consistency's sake, so students know what to expect when their behavior reaches the level of an office managed referral. And just like before, we would encourage you to take a look at the language and infuse some restorative language into this. And then so finally, once you have this plan set aside, you know which behaviors will be managed in the classroom, which will be managed in the office, and how they will be managed. We would encourage you to think about procedures for behavior response plan education. So just because you have the policy written down doesn't mean everybody knows, understands, and lives by those policy changes or procedure changes. So we would encourage you to think about how your staff, families, and students will learn about this change to your behavior response plan. And also consider, when do staff write the referral? How is the data collected? When is it shared out? Staff, it's helpful for them to know when they're writing a referral that somebody is looking at it or something is happening with it. So reflecting that data back to staff, families, and students can be a really powerful way to garner buy-in as well, for them to increase consistency with writing the referrals and collecting data. And same in that last bullet, how you track outcomes and effectiveness. So just because you are collecting the data doesn't mean that all of our responses to behaviors are effective. So how are you going to look and analyze that data to ensure that your responses are aligning with the needs of your students? So those were just some questions to consider. I'm sure there are other considerations you may have if you want to advance to the next slide. If you're considering or in the process of going through this, we encourage you to reach out either to your regional consultant. Catherine serves South Central and I serve Southwest New Hampshire. If you find that your consultant isn't up on the screen right now, please still reach out to us. We're happy to either have a conversation or provide resources or materials and templates. So please do reach out here in an email, or you can always find more resources on our website as well. So looking ahead, in our next video, we'll be talking about school-wide acknowledgement systems, which will be the 4th installment. And if you haven't seen the first 2 videos, we encourage you to look back on our YouTube channel and find those there as well. As always, thank you so much for tuning in, and we look forward to hearing from you. Have a great day.